Hello, everyone, and welcome to SCC Grant Basics. This is an onboarding training for new grantees. However, if you're a current or returning grantee, it's always good to get a refresher on grant paperwork. Joining me is Erin Gravely, one of our Central Coast project managers. During this training, please use the chat to ask general questions. Our staff will answer or will touch on them when the training is over. Please save the more specific and detailed questions for office hours after this training and event wrap-up. If you're a current grantee, please share your experience and tips for the newer folks in the chat. Okay, so you've received the grant. Now what? This flowchart represents an overview of the grant process. We'll walk through each step during the webinar and highlight key components. These steps consist of the grant agreement, conditions precedent, work program, starting work, progress reports and invoicing, and project completion. Projects are approved by the board. Your project manager will work on the grant agreement. The grant agreement outlines the terms and conditions of the grant. It is a legally binding document, and any formal changes require an amendment. Your project manager will determine if and when an amendment is necessary. 3 key dates to take note of in the grant agreement is the work completion date, which is the date all work needs to be finished by. Any work undertaken after this date will not be reimbursed. The final request for disbursement, or RFD, date is when your final invoice is due and normally takes place 1 month after the completion date. The grant termination date is the day when your grant legally expires. This is about 3 months after the final RFD date. All grant agreements have a conservancy number, such as 25-001, that will be used on all documents relating to your grant. The conditions precedent to disbursement are the set of items that need to be submitted and approved by your project manager prior to starting work. These consist of the board resolution, work program, insurance, and maybe permits. The board resolution is where your board will authorize entering into an agreement with the conservancy to accept grant funds. The board resolution will designate a person at your organization to follow the grant requirements and execute the project. The work program is also part of the conditions precedent, but we're going to skip this for now and go into greater detail on this in the next section. For proof of insurance, our required limits can be found on our website or by reaching out to your project manager. We may need to see proof of watercraft insurance depending on your project. And for permits, most ETC projects are coastal recreation projects, and permits might not be needed. These are more so for habitat restoration projects. Thank you, and now passing it off to Erin to cover the next section.
Once you receive this letter, you may start invoicing for any costs from the NTP date until your grant completion date. We'll now go into detail on one of the big conditions precedent, the work program. Next slide, please. So the work program, which is also sometimes referred to the work plan, those terms are interchangeable, is a document that you will write with input from your project manager. It serves 2 purposes. The first of which is to work alongside the grant agreement to guide your project towards completion. The second is to establish the project's budget and schedule. Since the grant agreement can only be changed through a formal amendment process, you can think of the work program as a flexible document that can be revised by working with your project manager. This year, we do have a special Explore the Coast specific work program template that's more tailored towards ETC projects, and which includes detailed instructions to guide you as you draft your work program. We highly recommend you use that template. It should really help you along in the process of drafting your work program. Next slide, please. So first in the work program is going to be your project description. This should provide a concise high-level summary of your project, stating its goals and what will be done to achieve them. So, for example, here, the program goals, they're kind of like mission, and then the specific programming and the number and type of participants that will be served. Next slide, please. So the next section in the work program is usually the longest. That's going to be your work program scope of work. It's the section where you're going to describe your project in task form. You'll provide a short narrative description containing important details for each task. The narrative will contain outcomes, and the task deliverables will be the work products produced through this task. For instance, if an outcome of a task is to train 5 camp instructors, then a suitable deliverable will be a camp instructor roster. There are different ways to break up your project by task. One way is to organize your tasks by expense type. All the work that will incur planning expenses, such as staff time to plan trips or recruit participants or materials for things like flyers, can go into a planning task, whereas all the work that would incur implementation expenses, such as transportation, food, and staff time to run the trips, can go into an implementation task. Alternately, you could organize your tasks by activity. For example, if your project has both day trips and overnight camping trips, you could have a task for each that would encompass both planning and implementation for those activities. Work with your project manager to come up with the best approach. In this example here, the grantee went with the planning implementation approach. The deliverables are required to be turned in with requests for disbursement and or upon completion of the project, depending on the type of deliverable. All the deliverables should be received before the project is completed. Reminder that the deliverables are tangible items that could be placed in a file, such as reports, photos, copies of curricula, etc. Next slide, please. Then there's the work program schedule section. This section describes your scope in table format and contains all the same task numbers, task titles, and the deliverables associated with each, along with the estimated start and end dates. And I'll hand it back to Morgan.
Thanks, Erin. Next slide, please. Okay, the budget section is one of the most important parts of your work program. The task numbers and task titles should match the scope of work and schedule sections of the work program. It is important to be simple here so that our project management and contracts departments can easily read your budget and check it against your invoices. You can insert line items for food, travel or transportation, subcontractors, and fiscal sponsorship fees if using a fiscal sponsor. We've highlighted 2 examples here by type of expenses on the left, and on the right is based on activities. Next slide, please. The budget detail section is a narrative of budget expenses. You'll list materials and equipment, travel costs, labor, indirect costs, and subcontractors. All organizations that receive Conservancy funding are required to meet strict accounting standards. While rare, there's always a possibility of an audit. It is the responsibility of all grantees to use the generally accepted accounting principles published by the American Institute of Public Accountants. Next slide, please. Direct costs are the specific expenses related to carrying out your project. Direct costs include labor for project management and implementation, project-specific materials and equipment, and subcontractors. In the work program, under labor, list the titles of the staff that will be billed to the grant. Do not include pay rates here. You'll also want to list out any special materials and equipment you'll need to purchase for project purposes. If you expect to purchase equipment that will last longer than the length of your grant, you'll need to insert language stating that such equipment will be retained by you, the grantee, for similar project purposes in the future. There is guidance for this language in the work program template. Just prior to purchasing any equipment, check in with your project manager. You'll want to also include fiscal sponsorship fees in the direct costs section of the work program and describe any travel costs such as bus or car rentals or mileage reimbursement. Next slide. Okay, we do have a resource for you all, an allowable cost chart. It's linked in the work program template, and Amanda linked it in the chat. Thank you. Read the full document because some items are on a case-by-case basis. And again, if you're ever unsure or have questions, please talk to your project manager. Of an example of some costs we cannot pay for are gift cards, gifts, prizes, and vehicle purchases. We are a state agency and public funds need to be spent on only reasonable and necessary costs. Next slide, please. Indirect costs or overhead costs are the non-project specific costs of doing business. This includes rent, utility bills, and general purpose equipment such as computers. We allow grantees to bill up to 20% of the grant total to indirect costs. We recommend working with an accountant to determine your indirect cost rate, as you'll be expected to keep detailed records of your expenses should an audit recur. And next slide, and passing it back to Erin.
Thanks. So also in the budget narrative section of your work program, you will discuss any subcontractors. So you're going to list out your subcontractors if you'll be using any. These are entities who you'll be hiring to perform work under your grant. Examples of subs are kayaking instructors, wilderness safety instructors, and community partners carrying out direct project work. You'll state the name of the subcontractor, their qualifications. They have a website, you can link to that, and a brief scope of work. If you realize after the work program is approved that you need to hire another subcontractor, simply email your project manager first before incurring any costs with that subcontractor to get with the same information to get them approved in your work program before hiring them. Next slide, please. The last section of the work program is the plan for acknowledgement. This is the final, this is a grant requirement. The Conservancy would simply like to be acknowledged in your organization's announcements or communications materials when mentioning your ETC program. This helps give us the recognition to ensure that future funding is made available to the Explore the Coast Grants program. You can lay out your plan in this section. Some examples of ways to acknowledge us are tagging us or including our logo in social media posts, website announcements, press releases, program brochures, or on your participant sign-up sheets. Next slide, please. Once all the conditions precedent are satisfied, your PM will send you your notice to proceed letter and you can start work on the grant, which naturally leads to the next question. Next slide, please. How do I get paid? Most often, our grants are on a reimbursement basis. You can invoice as frequently as monthly, but please invoice at least quarterly. There is no set schedule for invoicing. Work with your PM to determine a good schedule. Don't invoice for any work before your NTP date. Your invoices will comprise a completed request for disbursement or RFD form, a progress report, and cost backup documentation into one PDF. All direct costs and subcontracts need to have backup documentation. Do not include any deliverables with your invoice. Those can be sent directly to your PM. Next slide, please. So the progress report should cover the same set of time as the RFD and should detail the project work done for each task during that time. Please use our Explore the Coast specific template. Your project manager can provide that to you. There's a final report template for when you file your submit your final request for disbursement. Paired with the RFD, the progress report should tell the story of the costs incurred. We also want to hear about the project progress, challenges, and successes for that billing period. Please do be informative, but feel free to be brief. Bullet points are fine. We don't want this to be the piece that's holding up your invoices. And we do love photos and stories, so please do include those. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Erin. All right, all, here is a screenshot of the progress report you'll submit with each invoice. Again, keep work brief and include bullet points if you'd like. Be sure to keep track of participant data as you'll need it here and in your final report. Next slide, please. Okay, here is our RFD, or request for disbursement form. It's a 2-page form and part of the overall invoice. We have this template in both Excel and PDF versions. Next slide. The first page summarizes all expenses from the billing period. The task number, name, and budget must match what is in the approved work program. So for example, if task 1 is project management, you should list task 1 project management with a budget of, for example, $10,000